Welcome back to Sleepless History, the podcast where we take the long, winding roads of the past and turn them into something quiet, calm, and deeply unhurried. I'm glad you're here. Tonight's episode is a long one, because the people we are going to talk about deserve that kind of time and that kind of patience. They are mysterious, they are ancient, and for a very long time, the world barely remembered them. They left behind no literature written in their own hand, no great surviving libraries, no chronicles composed by their own scholars. What they left behind were stones. Remarkable, beautiful, baffling stones carved with images and symbols that even today we do not fully understand. They left behind place names buried inside the Scottish landscape, like seeds waiting to sprout. And they left behind a history that, when you dig into it carefully and slowly, turns out to be far richer and far more complex than anyone once gave them credit for. We are talking tonight about the Picts. The Picts, a people who occupied the northern and eastern parts of what we now call Scotland, roughly between the years 300 and 900 AD. A people who were dismissed by their enemies as painted savages, who were squeezed between the Romans to the south and the sea to the north, who built a remarkable culture, who had kings and kingdoms and symbol systems and elaborate artistic traditions, and who eventually, quietly, faded from the historical record, absorbed, transformed, and mythologized into something that became Scotland. We are going to take our time with them tonight. We are going to move slowly and carefully through their world. We are going to talk about where they came from, what their world looked like, how their society was organized, how they lived and farmed and traded and worshipped. We are going to talk about their kings and their battles, their conversion to Christianity, the long, slow political story of a people holding their ground for centuries. And we are going to talk about how they eventually disappeared, not violently erased, but gradually transformed, and what they left behind. If you've tuned in tonight to help your mind drift off, you're in the right place. That's the reason I create these. If you find this helpful, consider subscribing and leaving a comment about where you're listening from and what the time is. I love reading through the comments. There's something surreal about knowing someone is watching at midnight in San Francisco while someone else is starting their day in Stockholm or grabbing a quick lunch in Sydney. Chapter 1: The Origins and World of the Picts. To understand the Picts, you have to begin with a problem. And the problem is this: we do not know exactly where they came from in the sense of cultural and political origin, and we do not know what language they spoke in any complete or recoverable way, and almost everything we know about them in their earlier centuries comes not from their own words, but from the words of people who either feared them, fought them, or wanted to convert them: the Romans, the Irish monks, the Anglo-Saxon chroniclers to the south. All of these sources have their biases and their blind spots, and so the history of the Picts is a history assembled from fragments, from archaeology, from the carved stones they left behind, and from the very careful work of modern scholars who have spent their careers trying to hear a voice that never quite wrote itself down. But that is part of what makes this story interesting, and it is part of what makes it restful in its way, because we are not going to pretend that we know everything. We are going to sit with the uncertainty, and we are going to trace what we do know, and we are going to let the gaps be gaps without filling them with invention. So, let us begin at the beginning, or as close to it as we can get. The territory we are talking about, the land that the Picts inhabited, is the land that lies roughly north and east of a line drawn from the Firth of Forth in the southeast up to the Great Glen in the northwest. This is, broadly speaking, the eastern lowlands and highlands of what is now Scotland, the great curve of the coastline from Fife up through Angus and the Mearns, the broad river valleys of the Tay and the Don, the northeastern tip of the country around modern Aberdeen, the peninsula of Caithness in the far north, and across the water, the Northern Isles Orkney and Shetland. This is Pictish territory. Not all of it at all times, and with significant variations in exactly who controlled what and when, but this is, broadly, where the Picts lived. And before the Picts, or before the label Pict was applied to the people living here, there were the Iron Age tribes of northern Britain. These were Celtic-speaking peoples, related culturally and linguistically to the tribes of southern Britain and of Gaul, people who built the remarkable circular towers we call brocks, those extraordinary dry stone structures, hollow-walled and tapering, which still stand in places like Moosa in Shetland, that most perfectly preserved of all Scottish brocks, a tower of fitted stone that rises to over 13 metres and has stood for more than 2,000 years. The people who built the brocks, who lived the Iron Age life of the far north, are in some sense the ancestors of the Picts. They did not become the Picts overnight. There is no clean line, but there is a continuity of people and of place that connects the Iron Age inhabitants of northern Britain with the people the Romans would eventually start calling Picti, and the Romans. The Romans are where the name begins. The first written use of the word Picti as a name for the people of the far north of Britain appears in a Roman source from around the year 297 AD. The writer was a panegyrist, someone whose job was to compose flattering speeches in honour of the emperor, and he used the word almost in passing as part of a list of the northern enemies of Roman Britain. Picti, it is a Latin word. It means, more or less, painted people or tattooed people. And so, right from the very beginning, the name we know them by is not their own name for themselves. It is a name given to them by outsiders, by Romans, probably referring to the practice of body painting or tattooing that Roman observers noticed and found remarkable. What the Picts called themselves is something we simply do not know with certainty. There is some evidence in later sources of a name, something like Pryteni or Prithu, which some scholars have connected to an older Celtic word for the people of Britain more broadly. The Welsh word Prydain, meaning Britain, may share this root. But the Picts left no texts in their own language, explaining who they were or what they called themselves, and so we are left with the Roman label, the outsider's name, painted onto a people like the paint itself. Now, about that paint, about that name, Picti, the Roman and later medieval sources are quite insistent about this business of painting and tattooing. Classical writers describe the people of the far north covering their bodies with woad of blue dye, extracted from a plant, or with elaborate tattoos. Julius Caesar had written, back in the 1st century before the Common Era, that the Britons generally used woad to colour themselves, and later writers extended and embellished this idea in relation to the northern tribes specifically. By the medieval period, the image of the woad-painted Pict had become almost a cliché, the wild, blue, savage northerner, incomprehensible and frightening to civilized eyes. how much of this is accurate is genuinely uncertain. Woad does produce a blue colour, but it fades quickly on skin and is not an ideal tattoo pigment. It is possible that some body painting was practiced at certain ceremonial or martial occasions. It is possible that tattooing was practiced using other materials. It is also very possible that Roman writers were exaggerating or generalizing from limited observation, applying the broader stereotypes of the barbarian North to a people they barely understood. The archaeology does not give us tattooed Picts. Skin does not survive well in the northern climate, and so we cannot say definitively how literally to take the painted people of the name. What the archaeology does give us, however, is a picture of a people who were anything but simple. The Picts of the first few centuries of the Common Era were heirs to a rich Iron Age tradition. They practiced agriculture, growing barley and oats, and raising cattle and sheep on the good agricultural land of the eastern lowlands. They fished heavily, given the extraordinary richness of the northern seas. They built substantial settlements and farmsteads. They had craft traditions working in iron and bronze and bone, producing tools and ornaments. They were organized into tribal groupings, almost certainly with chieftains or petty kings at the head of each group. They were not the painted savages of Roman imagination. They were a complex Iron Age people, doing what people do, farming and raising families and building communities and occasionally raiding their neighbours. But of course, the Romans are part of this story too, and in a significant way, because the Romans came north. They came north more than once, and each time they ran up against the reality that the far north of Britain was not going to be conquered and incorporated into the empire without enormous cost and effort. The Emperor Hadrian built his famous wall, Hadrian's Wall, across the narrowest part of northern Britain, from the Solway in the west to the Tyne in the east, completed around the year 122 AD. This wall was not primarily a military fortification in the sense of a front line to be defended against massed attack. It was more of a controlled boundary, a managed frontier, a statement about where the Roman world ended and the world beyond began. Everything north of the wall was, in Roman eyes, beyond, barbarian, foreign, unconquered. Then, a generation or so later, the Emperor Antoninus Pius pushed the frontier further north, building the Antonine Wall, a turf rampart running between the Forth and the Clyde, completed around the year 142 AD. This represented a more ambitious attempt to bring more of northern Britain under Roman influence or control, but it did not last. The Antonine Wall was abandoned within a generation or two, and the frontier pulled back to Hadrian's Wall. The people of the north, including the ancestors of the Picts, had proven too difficult, too expensive, too resistant to incorporate. And then there were the campaigns. The great Roman general Gnaeus Julius Agricola campaigned deep into the north of Britain in the late 1st century AD, and his campaigns were recorded by his son-in-law Tacitus in the famous Agricola, one of the great works of Roman historical literature. Tacitus describes a climactic battle at a place he calls Mons Graupius, somewhere in the northeast of Scotland, though the exact location is debated, where the Roman army inflicted a devastating defeat on a confederation of northern tribes. The speech Tacitus puts in the mouth of the northern chieftain Calgacus before the battle is one of the most famous passages of Latin literature, including the line, and this is one of those historical quotes so well known, it deserves a moment in which Calgacus says of the Romans something along the lines of, "They make a desert and call it peace." Whether Calgacus actually said anything like this, or whether he is entirely a literary invention of Tacitus, is uncertain. But the sentiment captured something real. The Roman war machine in the north was destructive, and the people of the north endured it. After Agricola's campaigns, the Romans did not permanently occupy the far north. There were periodic, punitive expeditions. The Emperor Septimius Severus campaigned in the north around the years 208 and 209 AD, deep into what we would call Pictish territory, though of course the word Pict was not yet in use. He died at Eboracum, modern York, in 211 AD, without having achieved a permanent settlement of the northern frontier. And so the pattern continued. The north remained beyond the wall, the people of the north remained outside the empire, and a boundary of sorts, never perfectly fixed, always contested, marked the edge of the Roman world. All of this is the context in which the Picts as a named people emerge. By the late 3rd century AD, when the Roman sources first use the word Picti, they are referring to a reality that had been building for generations. There are people in the north of Britain. They are organized enough and militarily capable enough to mount sustained raiding and resistance against the Roman frontier. They are not a single unified nation in any modern sense. They are almost certainly a loose collection of tribes and petty kingdoms sharing enough cultural and political identity that Roman observers grouped them under a single name. And they are, from this point on, one of the defining forces in the politics of northern Britain. The Roman record from the late 3rd and 4th centuries AD mentions the Picts with increasing frequency, almost always in the context of raids and attacks on the Roman province of Britannia. Alongside the Picts, the sources also mention the Scotti-Irish raiders coming across the sea from the west, and the Saxons, Germanic raiders from across the North Sea to the east. Together, these three groups represented a constant pressure on late Roman Britain from all directions. The famous barbarian conspiracy of 367 AD, the Conspiratio Barbarica, as Roman sources called it, involved, allegedly, a coordinated assault on Roman Britain by Picts, Scotti, and Saxons simultaneously. Whether this was truly a coordinated conspiracy or simply a period of unusually intense raiding from multiple directions at once is debated by historians, but it gives a sense of the threat that the northern peoples represented to Roman Britain. Now, I want to pause here and think about what the Picts' world actually looked like in these early centuries, the 3rd and 4th centuries AD. Because it is easy to get caught up in the Roman perspective and to see the Picts only through the eyes of the people they were raiding, the people who feared and despised them. But the Picts had an interior world. They had a society, and even from this early period we can sketch some of its outlines. Pictland, and that is sometimes the word used in modern scholarship, a convenient, if somewhat informal label for the territories under Pictish control, was not a uniform landscape. It included the fertile agricultural lowlands of what we now call Angus and Fife and Perthshire, where good soil and relatively mild weather allowed for productive farming. It included the more rugged upland country further north and west. It included the coastal fringes, where fishing and maritime activity were central to life. And in the far north and the islands Caithness, Orkney, Shetland, It included a world where the growing season was short, the seas were dominant, and life was organized around those realities. The Pictish economy in these early centuries was fundamentally agricultural and pastoral. Cattle were enormously important, as they were across the Celtic world, generally both as a practical resource and as a measure of wealth and status. A person standing in Pictish society was reflected in part by how many cattle they owned. Grain growing was widespread in the better agricultural areas, and the evidence from archaeological sites suggests a diet that combined cereals with animal products, fish, and gathered resources from the sea and the land. Settlement patterns in Pictish territory varied by region. In some areas, the evidence points to substantial enclosed farmsteads, essentially a cluster of buildings, a main longhouse for the family and their animals, storage buildings, perhaps a separate building for crafts surrounded by a ditch or palisade. In others, the evidence suggests smaller, more scattered farmsteads. The Great Brocks, those Iron Age towers, had mostly gone out of use as primary residences by the period we are discussing, though some continued to be occupied in modified form. Souterrains, underground stone-lined passages, presumably used for food storage, are a distinctive feature of Pictish sites, particularly in eastern Scotland, and their presence tells us something about the need to store agricultural surplus and manage it across the seasons. At the social level, Pictish society appears to have been organised along broadly hierarchical lines that were common across the Celtic world. At the top were kings, and we will spend a great deal of time on Pictish kings and kingship in a later chapter. Below them were aristocratic warriors, the people who fought and gave loyalty to the kings and received land and gifts in return. Below them were the free farmers and craftspeople who made up the bulk of the population. And at the bottom, almost certainly, were slaves, a feature of Iron Age and early medieval Celtic societies that archaeology and incidental references in texts confirm, even if the details are hard to recover. What we cannot recover fully, because they did not write, is the intellectual and spiritual life of the early Picts. Their religious practices in the pre-Christian period are largely invisible to us. We can make some inferences from archaeology, from the kinds of objects deposited in the ground, from the location of certain sites, from comparisons with other Celtic peoples, but we cannot hear the prayers or know the names of the gods or reconstruct the rituals. What we can say is that the Picts, like their Celtic neighbours and predecessors, almost certainly had a rich, religious and ceremonial life, and that some of the remarkable symbol stones they left behind, of which we will speak at length, may encode aspects of that spiritual and ceremonial world, though their precise meaning remains one of the great unsolved puzzles of British archaeology. The symbol stones. Let us talk about the symbol stones now, even though they will come up again and again throughout this episode, because they are so central to everything we know and feel about the Picts. Starting sometime in the 5th or 6th century AD, perhaps even earlier, the chronology is debated, and continuing through to roughly the 9th or 10th century, the Picts produced a remarkable body of carved stone monuments. These are found across the entire span of Pictish territory, from Shetland in the north to Fife in the south, from the west of Scotland to the eastern coast. Several hundred survive. They are of different types and from different periods, and scholars have organised them into a rough typology. The earliest class, what scholars call Class 1 stones, are unworked boulders or natural stone slabs. on which symbols have been incised, carved into the surface with a clean, confident line. These stones bear a repertoire of symbols that are remarkably consistent across the entire Pictish territory. The same symbols appear on stones from Orkney and stones from Fife, separated by hundreds of miles, which tells us that there was some shared cultural and communicative tradition across the Pictish world. The symbols include animal forms, the famous Pictish beast, a sinuous creature that looks something like a seahorse or a swimming creature of indeterminate species, the eagle, the salmon, the boar, the wolf, the horse, and they include a range of abstract symbols, the double disc and Z-rod, the crescent and Vadrod, the mirror, the comb, the rectangle geometric forms whose meaning has been debated for over a century and a half. What do these symbols mean? This is one of the great questions. The honest answer is, we do not know for certain. Various theories have been advanced. Some scholars have argued that the symbols represent names or identities that each symbol or combination of symbols encodes the name or lineage of an individual, perhaps a warrior or a king or a noble person commemorated on the stone. This is the so-called personal name or memorial theory, and it has attracted significant support. Other scholars have suggested the symbols represent property markers or territorial claims or clan affiliations. Still, others have proposed that they encode religious or cosmological ideas. The most recent scholarship tends toward the view that the symbols functioned as a form of communication about identity and possibly genealogy, that reading a Pictish symbol stone was, for a Pict, a bit like reading a name and lineage written in a visual language rather than an alphabetic one. But this is still not certain, and the debate continues. What is certain is that these stones represent an enormous investment of skill, time, and cultural energy. The carving is executed with great confidence and artistry. The animal forms in particular are rendered with a fluency and vitality that is extraordinary. These are not crude scratches, but works of genuine artistic sophistication. The Pictish artists who made these symbols clearly had a long tradition of training and practice behind them. They knew what they were doing, and they were doing something that mattered enormously to their community. Class 2 and Class 3 stones, which belong to the later Pictish period, the 7th through 9th centuries, and which will be discussed more fully in later chapters, add to the symbol repertoire crosses and biblical and Christian imagery, showing the transformation of Pictish artistic culture as Christianity spread. But even in these later stones, the old symbols persist alongside the new, suggesting a complex negotiation between old and new worlds rather than a simple replacement. All of this, the agricultural economy, the hierarchical society, the remarkable stones, the trading connections, the warrior culture, is the world in which the Picts lived. And it is a world that, for all its gaps and uncertainties, has a shape and a depth to it. These were not savages. They were not a mystery in the sense of something unknowable. They are a mystery in the sense of something not yet fully known, which is a very different thing. And as the centuries of the Common Era rolled forward, as the Roman Empire in the West declined and collapsed, as Christianity spread across Britain and Ireland, as new kingdoms rose and fell to the south and west, the Picts adapted and survived and built something lasting. Chapter 2: Kings and Kingdoms: The Political History of Pictland. Every history of the Picts has to grapple, sooner or later, with a list. It is a strange and ancient list, preserved in various medieval manuscripts, some in Latin, some in early Scottish Gaelic, and it purports to give the names and reign lengths of the kings of the Picts from the most legendary and mythological beginnings down to the historical period. This list is called, in modern scholarship, the Pictish King List, and it is one of the most discussed and debated documents in Scottish medieval history. The list begins in the realm of myth. The earliest entries include kings with names that belong to legend Cruithne, a name that is connected to the general Celtic word for the Picts themselves and his 7 sons, each of whom is said to have given his name to one of the provinces of Pictland. These early entries are clearly not historical in the ordinary sense. They are origin myths, etiological stories invented to explain the names of places and the organisation of the Pictish kingdom. No historian takes these early entries as literal history, but as the list progresses, it begins to approach the territory of history. The names become more plausible as historical names. The reign lengths become more varied and realistic. And from roughly the 6th and 7th centuries onward, the names in the Pictish king list can be correlated, at least sometimes, with references to Pictish kings in other sources' Irish annals, Northumbrian chronicles, Pictish monuments. This is where the history becomes more solid, even if it is never entirely secure. So let us try to sketch the political history of the Picts as best we can, moving chronologically through the period we are covering, roughly the 4th through 9th centuries AD. In the early period, the 4th century Pictland is not yet a unified kingdom in any recognisable sense. It is a patchwork of territories, each with its own king or chieftain, loosely connected by shared culture and the shared experience of being the people beyond the Roman wall. The Roman sources from this period talk about Picti as a collective term, but there is no reason to think there was a single Pictish king commanding all of this territory. The Picts in this period were, to use a word that will come up often in discussions of early medieval politics, a confederation, multiple separate political units sharing enough cultural identity to appear, from the outside, as a single entity. We get occasional glimpses into this world from Roman sources. The later 4th century was a period of increasing Roman difficulty on the northern frontier. In 367, the year of the so-called barbarian conspiracy, which we mentioned earlier, Picts, Scotti, and Saxons apparently launched simultaneous attacks on Roman Britain. The Roman general Theodosius was sent to restore order, and he apparently campaigned successfully in the north, even reconstituting a Roman province in some of the territory between the two walls. But this was temporary. The pressure from the north continued. By the early 5th century, the Roman administration in Britain was collapsing in 410 AD, the date most often given for the Roman withdrawal from Britain. Though the reality was more gradual, Britain ceased to be a Roman province in any effective sense. The legions were withdrawn. The administrative structure dissolved, and the political map of Britain began a rapid and chaotic transformation as the vacuum left by Rome was filled by local powers, by incoming settlers from the Germanic world, and by the competing ambitions of the various kingdoms that were emerging across the island. For the Picts, the end of Rome was, in one sense, a liberation. The great pressure from the south was gone, but it also introduced new pressures and new competitors. To the west of Pictland, in what is now Argyll, a group of Irish settlers, the Dalriata or Dalriada, were establishing a kingdom that would eventually become a major rival and then a successor to the Picts. To the south, the Britons of the old Roman territories were organizing themselves into kingdoms, some of which, like the Kingdom of Gododin in what is now southeastern Scotland, would be important players in the political world of early medieval northern Britain. And, from further south still, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of the Northumbrians were beginning to push northward and westward, eventually becoming one of the most significant threats the Picts would face. The Pictish king list for the 5th and early 6th century gives us names but little context. There is a king called Drust, or sometimes Drest, who appears multiple times, as the name was apparently popular or prestigious in Pictish royal families, the way certain names recur in dynasties. One early Drust is associated in later legend with Saint Patrick, the missionary to Ireland, which would place his reign in the 5th century, though this connection may be legendary rather than historical. The first Pictish king who emerges into something approaching genuine historical clarity is Bride, sometimes spelled Brood or Bride mac Melchon, who reigned in what the annals suggest was the latter half of the 6th century, probably from around 555 to 584 AD. Bride is important for several reasons. He appears in the Annals of Ulster, the great Irish chronicle tradition that, because Ireland was literate in this period, gives us more reliable dates and references than we otherwise have for Pictish history. He appears as a powerful and authoritative figure, and he is the first Pictish king who can be connected with some confidence to a specific historical encounter with a specific historical person, Saint Columba. Columba, known in Latin as Columba of Iona and in Irish as Columciae, was one of the great missionary figures of early medieval Christianity. Born in Ireland around the year 521, he was a monk of noble family who established the famous monastery of Iona on a small island off the southwest coast of what is now Scotland in the year 563. From Iona, Columba and his community undertook the evangelization of the peoples of northern Britain, and Columba apparently made a famous journey northward to visit Bride mac Melchon at his fortress. Some scholars have suggested this fortress was near Inverness, and there is a persistent tradition associating Bride's stronghold with the area around Craig Feidrig, a hill fort overlooking the Bowley Firth near Inverness, though the identification is not certain. The meeting between Columba and Bride is recorded in the Life of St. Columba, written by Adomnan, the 9th abbot of Iona, around the year 690. Adomnan's life is hagiography, a saint's life, designed to demonstrate the holiness and miraculous powers of Columba, not to provide neutral historical reportage. So it should be read carefully. But it is one of the most important documents for Pictish history of this period, and the encounter between the Irish abbot and the Pictish king has a vivid quality to it even through the hagiographic distortions. According to Adomnan, Columba arrived at Bride's fortress and found the gates locked against him. Columba made the sign of the cross and knocked on the gates, and they flew open of their own accord. This is the sort of miracle that fills hagiographic literature and should not be taken literally. What it encodes, however, is probably a political reality that Bride initially refused to receive Columba, and that Columba's persistence or his status, or some political negotiation we cannot see, eventually persuaded the king to grant him an audience. Once admitted to the king's presence, Columba apparently conducted a kind of spiritual contest with Bride's chief druid, a figure called Broichan in Adamnan's account, involving competing miracles and demonstrations of spiritual power. Again, the hagiographic language should not mislead us. What was probably happening was a serious political and theological negotiation between the representatives of an old religious tradition, the indigenous Pictish religious specialists, and the new force of Irish Christianity. And the outcome, at least according to Adamnan, was favourable for Columba. Bride reportedly received Columba with honour and granted him certain privileges, though the king himself is not said to have converted to Christianity at this point. What is significant about Bride mac Maelshon for our purposes is not just his encounter with Columba, but the picture of him that emerges from the sources. He appears to have been a powerful king, a king with authority over other Pictish kings, what the sources sometimes call a king of the Picts or an overlord. And there is an event associated with his reign that is striking, the Battle of Degsastan in 603 AD. Wait, I should note that the dating here needs a correction. Degsastan was after Bride's time. Let me step back. What Bride mac Maelshon is most clearly associated with, aside from his encounter with Columba, is a major military victory over the Dal Riata. The annals of Tigernach record under the year 560 that Bride won a great battle against the Dal Riata, a battle that seems to have significantly checked the expansion of the Irish settlers into Pictish territory. This battle, whatever its exact date and location, is important because it shows us something we will see repeatedly in Pictish history. The Picts were capable of organizing themselves militarily in ways that could defeat significant opponents, even when those opponents were not insignificant. After Bride mac Maelshon, the Pictish king list continues with a series of names that are often difficult to connect to external sources. The 6th and 7th centuries in Pictland are, in many ways, the darkest part of the Pictish historical record, dark in the sense of poorly lit, not in the sense of grim, though they certainly had their grimness too. We get names, we get occasional battle references in the Irish annals. We get the symbol stones, which continue to be produced, and which give us a sense of artistic and cultural vitality even when political history is hard to trace. What we can say about this period is that Pictland was not a single, unified, centrally governed kingdom. It was, almost certainly, a loose overlordship, a situation in which one king was recognized as paramount over others, but in which that supremacy was contested, alternated, and occasionally collapsed. The Pictish king list occasionally gives us what appear to be multiple kings ruling simultaneously in different parts of Pictland, suggesting a division of the territory between rival dynasties or families. The question of how succession worked in Pictish kingship is itself one of the great puzzles, and we will return to it. But let me now move into the 7th century, because the 7th century is where Pictish political history becomes both more visible and more dramatic. The great force in the politics of northern Britain in the 7th century was the Anglian kingdom of Northumbria, the Germanic kingdom that had consolidated the old Roman territories of northern England and was pushing northward and westward. The Northumbrians were, by the standards of the time, militarily powerful, politically sophisticated, and literate in the sense of having access to Latin education and the church's administrative machinery. They were also expansionist, and their expansion brought them into direct conflict with the Picts. The key battle is the Battle of Nectansmere in Gaelic, Lingarin, the Lake of the Cranes, fought on the 20th of May in the year 685. This battle is one of the most important battles in the history of northern Britain, though it does not always receive the recognition it deserves in broader historical narratives. The background is this. The Northumbrian king Ecgfrith was one of the most powerful rulers in Britain. His kingdom stretched from the Humber in the south northward through what is now northern England and into what is now southern Scotland. He had campaigned widely and successfully. He had established Northumbrian influence over parts of the Pictish territories. The Picts were in many ways under Northumbrian pressure and perhaps overlordship in this period. The Pictish king was a man named Bride mac Billy, a different Bride from the 6th century king, Bride being a popular name in Pictish royalty. Bride mac Billy was determined to free his people from Northumbrian domination. In 685, Ecgfrith led a Northumbrian army northward into Pictland. He ignored, according to the great Northumbrian historian Bede, writing a generation later in his ecclesiastical history of the English people, the advice of those who warned him against the campaign. He was drawn northward by what may have been a deliberate Pictish strategy of retreat, luring him deeper into territory where the advantage of numbers might be negated by terrain. The battle was fought near a lake. The exact location is not certain, but various places in Angus have been proposed as candidates, with Dunnichen in Angus most often identified. Bride mac Billy's Pictish forces turned on the pursuing Northumbrians, catching them, apparently, in a position where the ground did not favour them. Ecgfrith was killed. His army was destroyed. The Northumbrian advance into the north was stopped, definitively and permanently. Bede, writing from a Northumbrian perspective and with genuine sorrow about the defeat, gives us some of the most important testimony about this battle. He describes how, after Nectansmere, the Northumbrians lost all influence over the Picts, and how Pictish territory was effectively recovered by the Picts. He notes that many Northumbrians were killed and that others were enslaved. The defeat at Nectansmere was, for Northumbria, a catastrophe. For the Picts, it was a defining victory, a moment of liberation and assertion that would shape the political geography of northern Britain for generations. The significance of Nectansmere can hardly be overstated. Had Ecgfrith won, had the Northumbrians incorporated Pictland into their expanding kingdom, the entire subsequent history of northern Britain would have been different. There would have been no Pictish kingdom to eventually transform into Scotland. The north might have remained a Northumbrian territory, and the English kingdom might have reached all the way to the northern tip of the island. But Nectansmere stopped that. The Picts held their ground. After Nectansmere, the reign of Bride mac Billy appears to have been a period of Pictish strength and confidence. He died in 693, according to the annals, and after him the king list continues with a series of names and the ongoing, never-resolved question of Pictish succession. And here I want to pause on that question of succession, because it is genuinely important and genuinely strange. One of the features of Pictish society that has attracted more scholarly controversy than almost any other is the question of how kingship passed from one king to the next. In most early medieval kingdoms, the Frankish kingdom, the Northumbrian kingdom, the Irish kingdom's succession passed, however messily, through the male line. A king was succeeded by his son or his brother or his nephew through his brother. Patrilineal succession descent through the father was the norm. But the Pictish king list has a peculiarity. When you look at the list of Pictish kings and trace their apparent family relationships, you find that in a striking number of cases, kings do not seem to succeed their fathers. Instead, they seem to succeed through the female line, through their mothers. A king's successor is often his brother's son by a different mother, or a man who seems to be connected to the previous king through female descent. This pattern was noticed by early historians and led to the development in the 19th and early 20th centuries of the theory of Pictish matrilinear succession, the idea that kingship among the Picts passed through the female line, so that a man inherited his royal status from his mother, not his father. This theory was enormously popular for a long time and made the Picts seem uniquely exotic and fascinating among early medieval peoples. A society where women transmitted royal status, where the queen's bloodline was what mattered. This was a wonderful story. Unfortunately, like many wonderful stories, it has not survived scrutiny particularly well. Modern scholarship is much more cautious about matrilinear succession among the Picts. The main problem is that the Pictish king list is not a reliable genealogical document. It was compiled centuries after the events it records, and the scribes who compiled it may not have had accurate information about family relationships. What looks like matrilinear succession may be, in some cases, the normal messiness of early medieval dynastic politics usurpers, competing branches of royal families, periods of civil war, followed by the emergence of whoever was strongest. Another problem is that the external sources, the Irish annals, Northumbrian sources, do not seem to treat the Picts as having a fundamentally different succession system. And a third problem is that the one later source, the chronicle from the 9th century called the Duan Almanac, which gives something like a dynastic account, does not support a simple matrilinear model. So, what was Pictish succession? The honest, modern answer is something complex and probably variable. It may have been a system in which multiple branches of royal families competed for the kingship, with no simple rule determining the outcome, what some scholars call tanistry, a form of elective or competitive succession in which prominent men of royal blood competed for the throne. It may have had matrilinear elements in certain periods or certain regions. It was almost certainly not the neat, consistent system that the old theories proposed. It was, like most early medieval succession, messy, contested, and sometimes violent. The violence is important to note. Succession crises in Pictland were not merely political events. They sometimes involved the killing of rivals. The Annals of Ulster and the Annals of Tigernach record, over the centuries of Pictish history, numerous references to kings being killed not in battle, but apparently by rivals or by groups within the kingdom who opposed them. The Pictish kingship was not a peaceful institution. It was a prize, and it was contested, and the contestants did not always play gently. Moving through the 8th century, the Pictish political world becomes somewhat better documented, partly because the Irish annals become somewhat more detailed in their coverage of northern Britain, and partly because the Pictish kingdoms were interacting more intensely with their neighbours, the Dal Riata to the west, the Britons of Strathclyde to the southwest, and the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to the south. A significant figure of the early 8th century is Nectan Mac der Ile, who reigned as king of the Picts from around 706 to 724 A. D. Nectan is notable for several reasons. He was, apparently, a king who exercised genuine authority over a large part of Pictland. He was literate in the sense of having contact with the Latin-educated world of the church, and his relationship with the church is one of the important themes of his reign. He had a famous dispute, or rather, a famous communication with the monastery of Jarrow in Northumbria, specifically with the scholar Ceolfrith, a colleague and teacher of Bede, about the correct method of calculating Easter and about the correct style of monastic tonsure. These were, in the ecclesiastical world of the 8th century, genuinely significant theological and disciplinary questions connected to the broader conflict between the Irish Christian tradition and the Roman Christian tradition about how the church should be organized and how it should express its faith. We will return to this in the chapter on religion. Nectan also appears to have undertaken a significant political act that is recorded in the annals. He apparently expelled the Columban monks, the monks of the Irish tradition associated with the monastery of Iona from Pictland, replacing them or supplementing them with clergy of the Roman tradition. This was a significant cultural and political statement, asserting Pictish independence from Irish ecclesiastical influence. Whether it was fully or permanently accomplished is less clear. Nectan's reign ended in some confusion. He apparently abdicated or retired to a monastery, as kings occasionally did in this period, only to re-emerge and reclaim the kingship, which was a pattern not unknown in early medieval politics. After him, the mid-8th century saw a period of conflict and instability in Pictland. The most significant figure of the mid-8th century is Oengus mac Fergusa in Latin sources, Angus son of Fergus, who dominated Pictish history from around 732 to 761 AD. Oengus is arguably the most powerful Pictish king for whom we have substantial evidence, and his reign represents something of a high-water mark in Pictish political history. Oengus came to power through conquest. He fought his way to the kingship through a series of battles against rival Pictish kings in the 730s, and the annals record these conflicts with unusual detail. He defeated and killed a succession of rivals, consolidated control over the main Pictish territories, and then used this consolidated power base to pursue an ambitious foreign policy. His most significant external achievement was the conquest of Dal Riata, the Irish origin kingdom of Argyll, that had been a competitor and neighbour of the Picts for generations. In the 730s and 740s, Oengus campaigned repeatedly against the Dal Riata, and the annals record significant battles and, ultimately, the subjection of the Dal Riata to Pictish overlordship. For a generation or more, Dal Riata was, in effect, a dependency of the Pictish kingdom. Oengus also campaigned southward against the Britons of Strathclyde. He attacked Alt Clut Dumbarton Rock, the great fortress on the Clyde that was the centre of the Strathclyde British Kingdom, apparently more than once, though with mixed success. He formed an alliance with the Northumbrians against the Strathclyde Britons at one point, showing the kind of flexible, pragmatic diplomacy that characterised effective early medieval kingship. The picture of Oengus that emerges from the sources is of a formidable military and political operator, a man who used force effectively, who built alliances, who extended Pictish power beyond its traditional boundaries, and who maintained control over his expanded territory for an unusually long reign. He died in 761, having ruled Pictland for nearly 3 decades, which was exceptional longevity by early medieval standards. After Oengus, the second half of the 8th century saw Pictland begin to face new pressures. The Dalriata reasserted its independence. The Strathclyde Britons remained a significant presence to the southwest, and from the very end of the 8th century, a new and devastating force entered the picture: the Vikings. The first recorded Viking raid on the British Isles is usually dated to 793, with the famous attack on the monastery of Lindisfarne off the Northumbrian coast. Within a few years, the raids had extended northward, hitting the islands and coasts of what is now Scotland. The monastery of Iona was attacked in 795, and again in 800, and again in 806, a devastating sequence of raids that killed monks and burned buildings, and made clear that the sea routes of the north were now dominated by a new and terrible power. For the Picts, the Viking raids represented a serious threat, particularly to the coasts and islands. Orkney, which had been Pictish territory, the archaeology of Orkney in the Pictish period is rich and important, became a Viking zone. The Northern Isles as a whole shifted from Pictish to Norse cultural and political domination in the course of the 9th century. The Picts of the north and the coasts were under pressure in a way that their predecessors had not faced. And it is against this background of Viking pressure that the final chapter of Pictish political history plays out the story of the union with the Scots and the eventual absorption of the Pictish identity into the new Scottish kingdom. But that story belongs to the final chapter of this podcast, and we are not there yet. Let us first spend time with the deeper world of Pictish culture, society, religion, and art. Chapter 3: Culture, Society, and the Carved Stones. The Inner World of the Picts. When we talk about the culture and society of the Picts, we are talking about something that is simultaneously frustrating and wonderful. Frustrating because the Picts did not write, or if they did write, very little of their writing has survived in interpretable form, and so we cannot hear their own voices explaining their own world. Wonderful because what they left behind in stone and metal and bone and earth is rich enough, when looked at carefully, to give us real glimpses of how they thought and felt and organized their lives. Let us begin with the social structure, and then move outward to the arts and crafts, and then to the stones themselves. Pictish society, as we have already touched on, was hierarchical, but the details of that hierarchy are worth exploring. At the top, of course, were the kings, but Pictish kingship was not the only form of elevated status. There was an aristocratic warrior class men and probably women of high birth who held land, who could afford horses and weapons and fine ornaments, who owed military service to their king and received gifts and protection in return. The Latin sources, and to some extent the Irish sources, use the word nobles or magnates for these people, and their presence is confirmed by the archaeology, by the elaborate personal ornaments found in high-status contexts, by the evidence for feasting in large halls, by the weapon finds that tell us of a martial culture. The hall was central to aristocratic life across the early medieval world, and Pictish evidence, while limited, suggests it was central here too. The Great Hall, a large timber building where the lord and his retinue gathered to feast, to hear music, to receive guests, to conduct the business of the estate, was the social and political centre of the aristocratic world. It was here that the bonds of loyalty and patronage were maintained and renewed through the ritual of the feast, the giving and receiving of gifts, the telling of stories, and the singing of songs. We know from other Celtic societies what this world looked like and felt like, and there is no reason to think the Pictish version was fundamentally different. Below the aristocracy were the free landholders, farmers of middling status, the backbone of the agricultural economy. They owed various forms of service and tribute to those above them, but they had rights and standing in the community. The law tracts that survive from Ireland and Wales in this period, and there are no surviving Pictish law texts, so we must use parallels cautiously give us a sense of what a hierarchical Celtic society looked like in its details, the careful calibration of status, the elaborate systems of honour price, the compensation owed to a person's family for injury or killing, which varied according to status, the networks of obligation and patronage that held the whole thing together. Women in Pictish society are, as in so many early medieval contexts, largely invisible in the written sources. But there are hints. The Pictish symbol stones occasionally include what may be female figures. The later Christian-era stones depict women in biblical and devotional contexts. The legal tradition from neighbouring Celtic societies gave women certain rights to own property, to inherit in certain circumstances, to seek divorce, and it would not be unreasonable to assume something similar applied in Pictland, though we cannot prove it. Slaves, as mentioned, existed. References in Irish annals and elsewhere confirm that raiding and warfare in this period regularly produced captives who became enslaved, and that enslaved people were part of the social and economic fabric. The most famous Pictish adjacent story of slavery is the story of St. Patrick himself, who was taken as a slave from Roman Britain, possibly from somewhere near the Firth of Forth, though this is debated by Irish raiders, almost certainly in the late 4th or early 5th century. While Patrick was enslaved by Irish rather than Pictish raiders, the story gives a vivid illustration of the kind of raiding economy that characterized this world. The agricultural economy we have already touched on, but let us add some detail. The staple crops in Pictish territory were barley and oats, hardier grains well suited to the northern climate. Wheat was grown in the better agricultural areas of the eastern lowlands. Legumes, beans and peas were important nitrogen-fixing crops in the rotation systems. Cattle were the prestige animal, as across the Celtic world, but sheep, pigs, goats and horses were all kept. The horse was important not just for agriculture, but for warfare and travel. The Pictish warrior was, at least in the aristocratic class, a horse rider. Fishing was enormously important, particularly on the coasts and in the river valleys. The North Sea and the Atlantic coast of northern Scotland are extraordinarily rich fishing grounds, and the evidence from archaeological sites, fish bones, fishing weights, net sinkers confirms intensive exploitation of these resources. Salmon was both a practical food source and, in later Pictish art, a significant symbolic animal. It appears on the stones with particular frequency and vividness, suggesting that it held some cultural or spiritual significance beyond its role as dinner. Craft production in Pictish society was sophisticated. The metalworkers who made the great Pictish silver objects were masters of their craft. The hoard found at Norreys Law in Fife in the early 19th century included remarkable silver objects, leaf-shaped plaques decorated with Pictish symbols, a beautiful pin, and other pieces which date to roughly the late 6th or 7th century and represent the highest level of Pictish metalworking. The hoard found at St. Ninian's Isle in Shetland, discovered in 1958 by a schoolboy digging at the base of a small medieval church, is perhaps the most spectacular collection of Pictish silverwork that survives. 28 silver objects, including a beautiful set of decorated bowls, sword pommels, pins, and a unique hanging bowl, all wrapped in what may have been a leather bag or box, buried beneath the church floor, probably in the late 8th or 9th century, perhaps in response to the Viking threat. These pieces are extraordinarily sophisticated in their design, exquisite in their execution, bearing Pictish symbols and interlaced patterns of the highest quality. The St. Ninian's Isle treasure is now held in the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh, and if you ever have the opportunity to see it in person, I would encourage you to do so. There is something very moving about these objects, not just their beauty, which is real, but the sense of someone carefully gathering them together, wrapping them up, hiding them against some danger that was coming, and never returning to retrieve them. They waited in the ground for 1,200 years. The Picts also produced fine objects in other materials. Pin and brooch production, the great penannular brooches and other forms of dress fastening, shows the importance of personal adornment in aristocratic culture. Combs made of antler or bone are found at Pictish sites, and notably, the comb is one of the symbols that appears on the symbol stones themselves, a highly stylized comb, paired sometimes with a mirror, suggesting that these mundane objects of personal grooming carried some symbolic weight in Pictish culture. Textiles, which do not survive in the ground, were certainly produced in significant quantities. Spinning wools and loom weights are found at Pictish sites, testifying to the production of wool cloth and probably linen. The quality of the clothing worn by high-status Picts, which we can infer from the attention to personal appearance suggested by the comb and mirror symbols, and from comparative evidence, was probably considerable. And now, let us return to the stones, because the stones are so central to any understanding of Pictish culture that they deserve sustained attention. We discussed the Class 1 stones, the unworked boulders with incised symbols, in the first chapter. Let us now talk about the later classes. Class 2 stones are worked slabs, typically carved in relief rather than just incised, and they typically feature a cross on one face and Pictish symbols alongside scenes of figures, hunters, warriors, battles, ritual scenes, animals on the other. These stones appear to date from roughly the late 7th century onward, and they represent the fusion of the older Pictish symbolic tradition with the new world of Christian art and culture. The crosses on the Class 2 stones are remarkable works of art. They are carved in high relief, often filled with the kind of interlaced knotwork and zoomorphic animal form decoration that is associated with the broader tradition of insular art, the art of the British Isles in the early medieval period, shared among Irish, Scottish, Pictish, and Northumbrian artists, and visible in manuscripts like the Book of Kells and the Lindisfarne Gospels, as well as in the carved stones of Scotland. The Pictish contribution to this tradition was distinctive and important. The Pictish artists brought their own vocabulary of animal forms, their own particular way of composing spirals and interlace, their own habit of depicting specific animals with remarkable naturalism alongside the abstract patterning. The other face of the Class 2 stones, the face opposite the cross, is often a narrative field of great richness and complexity. We see hunting scenes, riders on horseback chasing stags, with dogs running alongside, the whole composition sweeping and energetic. We see battle scenes, with warriors on foot and horseback engaged in combat, shown with enough detail that we can sometimes make out elements of weaponry and armour. We see processions lines of figures, sometimes on horseback, sometimes on foot, apparently moving towards some ceremony or destination. We see single figures of great dignity. We see biblical scenes, Daniel in the lion's den, David fighting Goliath, the sacrifice of Isaac, scenes from the New Testament. One of the most magnificent of all Pictish stones is the Hilton of Cadboll stone, originally from a coastal site in Easter Ross in the far north of Scotland, now in its cast form on the original site and, in the original, in the National Museum of Scotland. The Hilton of Cadboll stone is a Class 2 stone of extraordinary quality. The cross face has been largely lost, but the other face survives magnificently. It shows a great hunting scene in the lower portion riders, dogs, deer, trumpeters, and above that, in the centre of the composition, a remarkable figure, a woman on horseback. She rides with a flowing mantle, her horse positioned sideways to the viewer, a hawk on her wrist. She is flanked by 2 male riders. She is clearly a figure of importance. Some scholars have argued she is a queen or a noble woman of the highest status. Others have suggested she may be a symbolic or allegorical figure. Her identity is unknown, but she is present, dominant, authoritative, and she is on one of the greatest Pictish stones ever made. Another remarkable stone is the Swainos stone in Forres, the tallest surviving Pictish stone, standing at around 6.5 meters, though Swainos stone is a misleading traditional name. It has nothing to do with any Swain or Swaino, being purely Pictish and dating to perhaps the 9th or 10th century. One face bears an elaborate cross in high relief. The other face tells what appears to be a military story. Rows of warriors, battle scenes, piles of headless bodies, a depiction of warfare that is graphic and detailed. It may be commemorating a specific battle, though which battle and against whom is unknown. The Aberlemno stone, standing at a crossroads in Angus, is another Class 2 stone of the highest importance. It bears on its reverse face a battle scene that has been convincingly interpreted as a representation of the Battle of Nectansmere of 685, the great Pictish victory over the Northumbrians. If this identification is correct, and many scholars find it persuasive, then this stone is the nearest thing we have to a Pictish war memorial commemorating the most important military victory in their history. The stone shows mounted and foot soldiers in combat, with Pictish warriors apparently winning the engagement, and a fallen warrior being harassed by a raven, a death scene of stark and powerful simplicity. Class 3 stones are the latest class in the typology, dating from the 9th and 10th centuries, and they drop the Pictish symbols almost entirely, showing Christian crosses and figural scenes without the old symbolic vocabulary. They represent, in a sense, the full absorption of Pictish artistic culture into the mainstream of early medieval Christian art, a loss of distinctiveness that runs parallel to the political absorption of the Picts into the Scottish kingdom. We will discuss this more in the final chapter. But before we leave the stones, I want to say something about what they mean for our understanding of Pictish culture beyond their art historical significance. The symbol stones were not private objects. They were public monuments, placed in landscapes that people moved through in graveyards, beside roads and trackways, on hilltops, near water. They were statements, made in stone, meant to be seen and read by the people of the community. The effort required to produce them, quarrying the stone, transporting it, the skill and time required to carve it was enormous. This was not a casual undertaking. It was a communal and probably a political act, something that required the patronage of powerful people and the skills of specialist craftspeople. When a Pictish community raised a symbol stone, they were making a statement. They were saying, "This place is marked, this person or family or community is here, this symbol carries meaning." The stones were part of a landscape of meaning, a way of writing on the world when you did not have an alphabet, or when you chose to communicate through this visual language rather than through a written one. There is something deeply human about this impulse to mark the world, to say, "We were here, and this is what we valued." And when you stand in a field in Angus or Perthshire and find yourself looking at one of these stones, the symbols strange and beautiful and just out of interpretive reach, you feel, if you are quiet enough, something of that presence. The Picts were here. They made this, and we are still looking at it. Let us now move on to the great question of Pictish religion, first the old religion, and then the transformation that Christianity brought. Chapter 4. Gods and Saints. Religion in Pictish Society. The religious life of the Picts is one of the most difficult aspects of their culture to reconstruct, because it is one of the aspects least well documented. Before Christianity arrived, the Picts, like their Celtic neighbours and predecessors, practiced a form of religion that was part of the broader family of Iron Age Celtic religious traditions. They had gods, or at least spiritual powers, forces, presences associated with the natural world, with specific locations, sacred springs, particular hills, certain rivers, with specific functions, war, fertility, the sea, the dead. They had religious specialists, priests or druids, the class of learned men and women who mediated between the human world and the spiritual world, who preserved the mythological traditions, who conducted the ceremonies and rituals. But we know almost nothing specific about Pictish pre-Christian religion, because it was not written down either before or after conversion. What we have are hints. We have the name Broican, the druid who appears in Adomnan's Life of Columba as the chief religious specialist at the court of Bride Mac Malchon, and who engages in a spiritual contest with Columba. We have a handful of place names that may preserve the names of pre-Christian sacred sites or deities. We have some archaeological evidence objects deposited in water, rivers, lakes, bogs, which is a pattern widely associated with votive offerings in Celtic religion. We have some of the Pictish symbols themselves, which may encode religious or cosmological ideas, though we cannot interpret them with confidence. The Pictish bests that sinuous, fantastic swimming creature that appears on so many of the symbol stones is one of the most interesting cases. It is not a real animal, or rather, it is a stylized and fantastical creature that combines features of several real animals: the beak of a dolphin or fish, the body of a swimming mammal, the spiral form of a coiling creature. Some scholars have suggested it represents a water spirit or a sea deity, consistent with the importance of water in Celtic religious practice. Others have argued it is simply a heraldic or symbolic animal, a kind of clan or family emblem, without specific religious meaning. Its appearance on stones from the coast and the interior, the lowlands and the islands, suggests it was not tied to any single region, but was a shared Pictish symbol. The animals on the symbol stones more generally, the eagle, the salmon, the boar, the horse, the bull, all appear in Celtic mythological tradition with significant symbolic associations, and it is tempting to see the Pictish animal symbols as connected to that broader Celtic symbolic world. The eagle is a royal and solar bird in many traditions. The salmon is associated with wisdom and with sacred springs and rivers in Irish mythology. The boar is a warrior animal, fierce and dangerous, associated with courage and aggression. The horse is connected to sovereignty and to the other world in Celtic traditions. Whether the Picts understood their animals in exactly these terms, we cannot say, but the resonances are suggestive. Now, Christianity. The conversion of the Picts to Christianity is a story that unfolds over several centuries, and it is a story with a number of different characters, different missionaries, different traditions, different political contexts, which makes it richer and more complex than the simple saint comes and converts king narrative that hagiography tends to offer. The question of when Christianity first reached northern Britain, and specifically the territories that would become Pictland, is debated. Roman Britain had been a Christian society in its later period. The Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan in 313 AD, granting toleration to Christianity throughout the empire, and by the 4th century, Christianity was well established in the urban centres of Roman Britain. Whether it reached into the territories beyond the wall, into what would become Pictland in the Roman period, is uncertain. There is some archaeological evidence from northern Britain of objects with Christian symbolism that might date to the 4th or 5th century, but it is ambiguous. More certain is the connection with Saint Ninian, about whom something should be said, even though almost everything about him is historically uncertain. Ninian is said to have been a British churchman who established a church or monastery at a place called Candida Casa, the White House, later called Whithorn in what is now Dumfries and Galloway in southern Scotland, probably in the late 4th or early 5th century. He is also said, in later tradition, to have conducted missionary work among the southern Picts, the Picts of the territories closest to the 4th Clyde line. But the sources for Ninian are very late. Bede mentions him only briefly, and the full life of Ninian was written by Aelred of Rievaulx in the 12th century, 700 years after the supposed events. How much historical reality lies behind the tradition of Ninian's Pictish mission is genuinely unclear. Modern scholars are cautious. What we can say is that by the 6th century there is firm evidence of Christianity among the Picts, or at least among some of them. The symbol stones, as we have noted, begin to show Christian imagery. Some of the early stones appear in contexts associated with Christian burial, and the encounter between Columba and Bride Mac Malchon in the 560s, however we interpret it, shows that the Christian mission was actively engaged with the Pictish royal world by that date. Columba of Iona is the central figure in the Christianization of the Picts, at least in the tradition that has come down to us. His mission from Iona, the small island he made into one of the most important centres of early medieval Christianity, reached out to the Picts, as well as to the Dalriata among whom he settled. The Life of Columba by Adomnan describes several incidents involving Picts, not just the encounter with Bride, but other stories of Columba travelling in Pictish territory, encountering ordinary Pictish people, healing the sick, performing miracles. These stories are hagiographic, but embedded in them are glimpses of what mission in this world looked like: a traveller, a community of monks, the crossing of boundaries between peoples, the encounter between old and new religious traditions. The Columban mission, the tradition of Irish Christianity that spread from Iona, was one of the most important forces in the Christianization of the Picts. But it was not the only one. Alongside the Columban tradition, there were other currents. The British Christian Church, the Church of the Britons of the South, had connections to the southern Picts that may predate Columba. Northumbrian Christianity, once the Northumbrian Church was established and expanding in the 7th century, also reached into Pictland, particularly in the period of Northumbrian political dominance over parts of the Pictish territories. These different Christian traditions did not all agree with each other on every point, and this is where we return to the great controversy of the 8th century that we mentioned in connection with King Nectan mac Deryle, the Easter controversy. The dating of Easter, the most important festival in the Christian calendar, was calculated by different methods in the Irish, Scottish tradition and in the Roman tradition. The differences were not enormous in practical terms, but they were symbolically enormous, because they meant that communities following different traditions might be celebrating Easter on different dates, which was, in the theology and ecclesiology of the time, a serious problem. The Roman tradition ultimately derived from calculations made by the Church in Rome, and it was the tradition that Rome insisted all churches should follow. The Irish tradition, followed by the monks of Iona and their daughter houses and affiliated monasteries, followed a different calculation, one that preserved an older method. This controversy played out across the British Isles in the 7th and 8th centuries. The famous Synod of Whitby in 664 AD was the occasion on which the Northumbrian Church chose the Roman tradition over the Columban tradition, a decision that Bede describes with approval and considerable detail. The Pictish Church was also drawn into this controversy, and it was this controversy that provides the context for the famous letter from King Nectan mac Deryle to Ceolfrith of Jarrow. The letter, preserved in Bede's ecclesiastical history, in Bede's account of what happened, was written by Nectan asking for authoritative teaching on the correct calculation of Easter and on the correct form of the clerical tonsure, the haircut worn by monks, which was another point of dispute between the Roman and Irish traditions. The Irish monks shaved the front of their head. The Roman monks shaved the top of the head in the familiar ring. Small thing, you might think. But in the world of 8th century church politics, the tonsure was a visual statement of allegiance, and Nectan's request to know the correct form was a significant political act. Bede describes Ceolfrith's response, a long, learned letter explaining the Roman position on both Easter and the tonsure and the outcome. Nectan accepted the Roman arguments, issued orders for the adoption of the Roman Easter throughout Pictland, and had monks of the new tradition trained to enforce the change. He also, as already mentioned, apparently expelled the Columban monks from Pictland. Whether this expulsion was total or partial or temporary, Bede's account gives a clear picture of a king using religion as a tool of political self-definition, asserting independence from the Irish ecclesiastical world associated with the Columban tradition. This is a reminder that religious change in the early medieval period was never purely spiritual. It was always entangled with politics, with identity, with alliance and rivalry. When Necton chose the Roman Easter, he was not just choosing a calendar calculation. He was choosing a set of political alignments toward Rome, toward the Northumbrian Church, which had already made the same choice, and away from the Irish tradition associated with Iona. After Nectan, the Pictish Church continued to develop. More monasteries were established. The great Pictish symbol stones of the 8th century increasingly show elaborate Christian scenes alongside or replacing the older symbols. Biblical narrative, the stories of the Old and New Testaments, became part of the visual language of the carved stones. Pictish abbots and bishops appear in the Irish annals with increasing frequency, showing the growth of an organised ecclesiastical hierarchy. The relationship between the older, pre-Christian symbolic tradition and the new Christian world was evidently complex. The persistence of the Pictish symbols on stones alongside Christian crosses for at least a century or more after the conversion suggests that the symbols retained their meaning and relevance for Pictish communities even after they had adopted Christianity. Some scholars have argued that the symbols were essentially secular, that they were about identity and lineage and social status, not about religion, and could therefore coexist with Christian imagery without contradiction. Others have argued that the symbols were gradually reinterpreted in a Christian framework, taking on new meanings within the new religious world. The truth may be some combination of these possibilities. What is clear is that the Pictish Church, by the 8th century, was a lively and creative institution. The art produced under its patronage was extraordinary. The craftspeople and artists who made the great symbol stones and the metalwork and probably illustrated manuscripts, none of which survive from Pictland itself, though their style is visible in the broader insular art tradition, were working in a tradition of skill and sophistication that placed them alongside the greatest artists of early medieval Europe. The place names of Scotland preserve the memory of early Christian sites in the Pictish area, even if the buildings themselves are long gone. The element eccles, from the Latin ecclesia, meaning church, appears in several Scottish place names in the east, suggesting early church sites. Kill, from the Gaelic sil, meaning a cell or church, itself probably from Latin, appears with enormous frequency in Scottish place names, marking the sites of early monastic cells and churches across the country, including in areas that were Pictish. Pit, a distinctive Pictish place, name element meaning something like portion of land or estate, appears in dozens of place names in eastern Scotland, particularly in Fife, Angus and Perthshire, Pitlochry, Pittenweem, Pitmedden, and many more. These pit names are perhaps the most enduring everyday legacy of the Picts in the Scottish landscape, a ghost of the language of a people long gone, still audible in the mouths of people who may never think about the Picts at all. There is one more aspect of Pictish religious life that deserves mention before we leave this chapter, and that is the question of sacred kingship. In many early medieval societies, and this appears to have been true of the Picts, the king was not merely a political and military leader, but a figure with a sacred or semi-sacred role. The prosperity of the kingdom, the fertility of the land, the order of the cosmos were all, in some sense, the king's responsibility and the reflection of the king's virtue or unworthiness. A good king brought good harvests, a bad king brought plague and famine. This was not merely a metaphor, it was a genuinely held belief in many early medieval cultures, including Celtic ones. For the Picts, the connection between kingship and the sacred may have been expressed in various ways in inauguration rituals. In the king's relationship with the religious specialists, first the Druids, then the clergy, in the symbolic gestures of sovereignty that are sometimes reflected in the art. The famous inauguration stone at Scone, the Stone of Destiny, which became the coronation stone of Scottish and later British kings, may have Pictish origins, though this is debated. If it does, it represents a continuity of the sacred geography of Scottish kingship from the Pictish period through to the historical era. Let us move on now to the economy and the wider connections of the Pictish world, the trade routes and the material culture that connected Pictland to a broader northern European world. Chapter 5. A World in Stone, Economy, Connections, Decline and Legacy. And here we are at the final chapter of this long, slow journey through the Pictish world. We have talked about origins and landscape, about kings and battles, about culture and art and religion. Now let us bring the threads together and talk about the economy and the wider connections of Pictland, and then, finally and gently, about how the Picts came to an end and what they left behind. The economy of Pictland, as we have touched on, was fundamentally agricultural, but it was not sealed off from the wider world. Pictland was connected to trading networks that stretched across the North Sea and the Irish Sea and beyond, and the goods that moved along these routes tell us something important about the place of the Picts in the early medieval world. The most striking evidence for Pictish external connections comes from what archaeologists call imported goods. At Pictish high-status sites, the kind of places where aristocrats and kings lived, excavators have found pottery and glass from continental Europe, particularly from Gaul and from the Mediterranean. The distinctive pottery known as ewer, a type of imported pot made in western France, is found at a number of Pictish and Irish sites from roughly the 5th through 7th centuries AD. The presence of this pottery tells us that the Picts, or at least their elite, were part of a trading network that brought luxury goods from the continent by sea. Wine was probably the most important commodity imported from the continent. Wine was not just a drink in the early medieval Christian world, it was liturgically necessary for the celebration of the Mass, and any community with a church needed access to it. But beyond its liturgical role, wine was a prestige item, a gift appropriate for kings and nobles, a marker of status and civilization. The amphorae and imported pots found at high-status Pictish sites were probably carrying wine, olive oil, and other Mediterranean goods north along the Atlantic sea routes. What did Pictland export in return? The precise commodities are harder to trace in the archaeological record because organic goods, hides, furs, grain, dried fish, slaves leave little direct trace. But we can make educated inferences. Furs and skins from the animals of northern Scotland were valuable commodities in the medieval world, sought after across Europe. Dried and salted fish, particularly herring and cod and salmon, from the extraordinarily productive northern seas, were an important trade good throughout the medieval period, and the fish processing technology to preserve them would have been available in Pictland. Walrus ivory, if the Picts had access to walrus hunting grounds in the far north, and there is some evidence they may have, was enormously valuable. And slaves were, unhappily, one of the most important commodities moving through the early medieval economy. The sea routes along which these goods moved were the arteries of the Pictish world. The North Sea connected Pictland to Scandinavia and the Germanic world to the east. The Irish Sea connected it to Ireland and Wales to the west. The Atlantic coast connected it to Brittany and Iberia, and, via the Mediterranean trade routes, to a world that stretched from the Arabian Peninsula to North Africa and beyond. When a Pictish noble in Angus drank wine from a continental pottery cup, he or she was, in a small but real sense, connected to the vineyards of Burgundy and the trade networks of the early medieval world. Within Pictland, the movement of goods was organised around the structures of the agrarian economy. The tribute system, by which lower status people owed various goods and services to those above them, was the mechanism by which agricultural surplus was concentrated in the hands of kings and nobles, who could then redistribute it or trade it. The feast was not just a social event, it was an economic mechanism, a way of converting agricultural surplus into social bonds and political loyalty. Markets and fairs were also probably important meeting points for exchange within Pictland, though the evidence for them is not as direct as in some other early medieval contexts. The church provided another network for the movement of goods, and people monasteries were often economically active institutions, managing estates, producing crafts, and serving as nodes in trade networks. The question of Pictish coinage is interesting. The Picts did not, as far as we know, produce their own coins. The coinage economy that was developing in late Roman Britain and continued in the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to the south does not appear to have extended into Pictland in any systematic way. Exchange was conducted through gift-giving, through barter, through the movement of prestige goods. This is not unusual for the period, and region Ireland also lacked coinage throughout the early medieval period, but it does tell us something about the scale and nature of Pictish commercial activity. It was embedded in social relationships and tribute systems, rather than operating through an abstract monetary medium. The harbours and landing places of the Pictish coast were important nodes in the economic and political geography of Pictland. Port Mahomac, on the Tarbat Peninsula in Easter Ross, has been excavated in recent decades in a project led by Martin Carver of the University of York, and the results have been remarkable. The site of Port Mahomac was home, in the Pictish period, to a major monastic community, one that produced carved stones, that processed cattle and fish on an industrial scale, that may have made the vellum on which manuscripts were written, and that had connections to a wide network of people and places. The monastery at Port Mahomac was a significant economic centre as well as a religious one. It is a vivid example of how the church and the economy were interwoven in the Pictish world. Port Mahomac also gives us, sadly, direct evidence of the Viking impact. The excavations found evidence of violent destruction at the site in the late 8th or early 9th century, burned buildings, smashed stone, signs of a catastrophic event. This destruction coincides in the timeline with the beginning of the Viking raids on the northern coasts of Scotland. The monastery at Port Mahomac was apparently attacked and badly damaged by Vikings, and it did not recover its earlier scale and importance. This is a microcosm of what was happening across the northern Pictish world in this period. The Viking raids were not just an inconvenience. They were destroying the infrastructure of Pictish cultural and economic life in the vulnerable coastal and island areas. And this brings us, finally, to the question of the decline of the Picts and what that word decline actually means, and how this story ends. The traditional narrative of the end of the Picts goes something like this. In the year 843 AD, a king of the Dal Riata named Kinnaid mac Aelpin Kenneth mac Alpin, as he is known in later tradition, became king of both the Picts and the Scots, uniting the two peoples under a single dynasty and thereby creating the Kingdom of Scotland. The Picts, in this narrative, are absorbed by the Scots, their identity dissolved, their culture replaced, their people either killed or assimilated. This narrative has a satisfying simplicity and a memorable date. Unfortunately, like most satisfying and simple narratives, it is considerably more complicated than it appears. Let us start with Kenneth MacAlpin himself. Synard mac Aelpin is indeed one of the most important figures in early Scottish history, and his emergence as a dominant figure in the mid-9th century is real and significant. But the date 843 and the dramatic narrative of conquest or union is much less certain than it sounds. The sources for this period are late, they were written well after the events, and they reflect the political concerns of later Scottish rulers who wanted a clear and authoritative origin story for their kingdom. The picture they give is almost certainly simplified. What appears to have happened, and this is the interpretation of much recent scholarship, is something more gradual and more complex. The Dal Riata and the Picts had been interacting, competing, and intermarrying for generations. The Viking raids were putting enormous pressure on both peoples, particularly in the west, which was Dal Riata territory, and in the north and the islands, which were Pictish territory. In this context of pressure from outside, the boundaries between Pictish and Dal Riata identity were probably becoming more fluid. Synard mac Aelpin, whatever his exact origin, and there is debate about whether he was primarily a Dal Riata king, a Pictish king, or something in between, emerged in this fluid period as the dominant political figure. The kingdom that emerged from this period, the kingdom conventionally called Alba, the Gaelic word for Scotland, was in many ways a Pictish kingdom. Its heartland was Pictish territory Perthshire, Angus, Fife. Its inauguration site at Scone was in Perthshire. Many of its administrative traditions were Pictish. The language that eventually dominated Gaelic, the language of the Dal Riata, replaced the Pictish language, but it was used to govern and name a landscape that was overwhelmingly Pictish. So what happened to the Picts? They did not simply vanish. They were not massacred en masse. They were gradually absorbed linguistically, culturally, politically into the new kingdom of Alba. Their language faded from use, replaced by Gaelic. Their old political identity, the Picts, as a distinct people with a distinct name, faded from use as the new kingdom built a new identity. Their art tradition was transformed. The great symbol stones gave way to the class 3 stones without symbols, and then to a more generically insular Christian art style that did not distinguish Pictish from Scottish or Northumbrian. But the absorption was never complete erasure. The Picts became the Scots, or rather, they were one of the principal components of what became the Scots. Their genes are in the modern Scottish population. Their place names are in the modern Scottish landscape. Their artistic traditions fed into the traditions that became Scottish culture. The street, Ninian's Isle treasure, is a Pictish treasure, sitting in a Scottish museum, in a Scottish city, visited by Scottish people who are, in some very real sense, the descendants of the people who made it. The question of the Pictish language deserves a final word. Whatever language the Picts spoke, and this is itself a matter of some debate, it was a Celtic language, almost certainly. The majority scholarly view is that Pictish was a Brittonic Celtic language, closely related to the ancestor of Welsh and Cumbric and Cornish, the Celtic languages of the ancient Britons. A minority view held that Pictish had a non-Indo-European component, that alongside the Celtic layer, there was an older linguistic stratum that predated the Celtic-speaking peoples of Britain. This minority view has attracted attention and fascination over the years, feeding into the romantic image of the Picts as a mysterious, unknowable people with ancient secrets. Modern scholarship is mostly skeptical of the non-Indo-European hypothesis. The evidence, on balance, points toward a straightforwardly Celtic language, though one with its own distinctive features. The Pictish language survives only in fragments in inscriptions on the symbol stones, which are written in a script called Ogham, the notched alphabet used in Ireland and by some British peoples, and which give us tantalizing but often uninterpretable glimpses of the Pictish linguistic world in personal names preserved in the king lists and annals and in place names. The Ogham inscriptions on Pictish stones are mostly short names or brief phrases, and most of them are still not fully understood because we have too little Pictish text to build up a confident picture of the grammar and vocabulary. It is one of the great frustrations of Pictish studies. But let us not end on frustration. Let us end on what the Picts leave us with that is real and present and permanent. The stones are the great gift. Wherever you go in eastern Scotland, in the gentle agricultural landscape of Angus and Perthshire and Fife, or along the more rugged coasts of Easter Ross and Sutherland and Caithness, or on the windswept islands of Orkney, the Pictish stones are present, sometimes in museums, beautifully preserved and carefully lit, with interpretation boards and scholarly commentary, sometimes standing in fields, alone in the landscape, weathered and worn, and needing you to come to them. The Magel Museum in Perthshire has the largest collection of Pictish sculptures in Scotland, over 24 stones in a small converted schoolhouse, every one of them extraordinary. The Grome House Museum in Rosemarkie has stones including the magnificent Rosemarkie cross slab, one of the finest Class II stones anywhere. The Pictish trail through Easter Ross takes you through a landscape studded with stones and early Christian sites. And beyond the stones, the Picts live in the landscape itself. Every pit place name, every aber, a Pictish word for a river mouth, preserved in Aberdeen, Aberfeldy, Arbroath, and elsewhere. Every inver, a Gaelic word that sometimes replaced Pictish aber at the same sites. The rivers and hills that the Picts named are still there, still called by versions of the names the Picts gave them, flowing and standing in a landscape that the Picts farmed and fished and marked with their stones. The legacy of the Picts is not a foreign, exotic legacy. It is not the legacy of a people who came from somewhere else and then left. It is the legacy of a people who were here in the place that became Scotland for centuries, who shaped that place and were shaped by it, who built something real and enduring, and who became, in the end, the foundation on which one of the great national cultures of Europe was built. When we look at the extraordinary flowering of Scottish art and culture in the medieval period, the great carved crosses, the illuminated manuscripts associated with the insular tradition, the political sophistication of the early Scottish kingdom, we are looking at something built on Pictish foundations. When modern Scotland looks for its deep past, for its oldest roots, it finds the Picts there, mysterious, yes, but present, painted, perhaps, but not painted over. And I think there is something fitting in the fact that the Picts chose stone as their primary medium. Stone is the most permanent of materials. Wood rots and cloth dissolves and skin fades, but stone waits. A symbol carved into a boulder in the 6th century is still there in the 21st, still carrying its mark, still turning its face to whoever passes by. The Picts made their marks in stone because, consciously or not, they knew that stone would last, and they were right. So that is the story of the Picts from the shadowy centuries before their name was written down, through the long political and cultural history of their kingdoms, through the conversion and the flourishing of their art, through the pressure of the Vikings and the gradual transformation into the Kingdom of Scotland. It is not a simple story, and it is not a complete story. The gaps and the uncertainties are real, and anyone who tells you otherwise is telling you something too simple. But it is a real story, and it is a story worth knowing. The Picts were here. They were real people, living real lives, farming and fighting and building and praying and making beautiful things. They looked at the same northern sky we can still look at. They heard the same sound of the sea on the same coasts. They walked in the same landscape whose bones are unchanged beneath the changed surface. They are not so far away if you are willing to be still and look for them. I hope, if you have been with me through this whole long journey tonight, that you feel something of that presence. And I hope that, wherever you are listening from, you are comfortable and warm and close to sleep. The night is full of quiet things. The stones stand in their fields. The rain falls on the cymbal stones as it has fallen for 1,000 years or more. The north is dark and deep and very old. Thank you for listening to Sleepless History. If this episode helped you rest, or if the Picts now feel a little less mysterious and a little more present to you, then it has done what it was made to do. Until next time, sleep well